All right. So once again, a very warm welcome to all of you. Good evening, morning, afternoon, wherever you are placed across the world. It is an absolute pleasure for us to have Ashish Kothari with us, and he introduces himself as an Indian environmentalist who works on the interface of development and environment. But that's, of course, a very minuscule uh, introduction of what he has been doing for decades right now in terms of his activist works associated with Beej Bachao Andolan, his works associated with Narmada Bachao Andolan, and various other co-curatorial work as well, I would say, in terms of his engagements with global Tapestry of Alternatives, Vikalp Sangam, and various other Radical Ecological Democracy, and various other platforms. Ashish, we are absolutely glad to have you with us.
Thank you. Thanks for the invitation. Glad to be here.
Um, to begin with a very basic question, I mean, of course, we will get into a bit more detailed discussions on your recent experiences in COP30 in Brazil and all. But to start off with a very basic question, since you keep on moving across through diverse spaces, you are writing, you are engaging with academics, you are engaging with community elders, you are engaging with grassroots activists, you are engaging with policymakers. So as you have been traversing through so many spaces, I think it would be very interesting to know from you, and especially with respect to this question, which we have been asking for generations now, but still it holds to be quite relevant, and that is, what are some of the foundational challenges that you see when it comes to translate policies into practice, especially in association with environmental conservation, environmental consciousness? I mean, we have been signing, pacts, we have been signing exchanges, we have been multiple transnational, intranational policies that have been taking place. Still, we are asking a lot of questions sitting in 2025, which were, of course, even asked 50 years, 60 years, and sometimes even 100 years back. So, which means something has really gone wrong. So, maybe if we can start our conversation on this point.
Yeah, sure, Sayan. Well, the answer is complex, but I'll try and give maybe two or three sort of big points to this. Number one, it's not just about translating policies into practice. Sometimes people say that India has amongst the largest number of laws and policies with relation to, say, environment or human rights, etc. Right? So why do we have such a bad situation? One of the reasons, of course, is poor implementation, and I'll come back to that. But more fundamentally, I think it's also about faulty policies themselves, or let's say a faulty structure of decision making and governance, and of course, a fundamentally faulty economic structure, which means that whatever policies are put into place, even when they are progressive or sound progressive, will not actually achieve the kind of results that we want them to achieve. So let me give you an example. We say that we have laws in place which are meant to make sure that all so-called development projects go through an environmental impact assessment and to some extent a social impact assessment. And that sounds good. Now, one problem is that, of course, a lot of the EIAs and so on are very badly done. They are cooked up, or they're meant to basically give a green chit to the project developer. So that's part of the problem. But the more fundamental issue is that we are not questioning the nature of development itself. So it has been assumed that India, like all other countries, will go down the path that the West has taken, which is large scale industrialization and commercialization and pursuing economic growth as the indicator of development, right? And to us, for the last 40 years of working on these sorts of issues, we feel that actually the model of development itself is very seriously flawed. It does not fundamentally take nature into consideration as something that is core, that has to be absolutely the core of whatever we do as human beings. And it doesn't take um, the dignity of labor also at the core. And it doesn't take human rights at the core, right? So, if we really want to think about policies that are going to be ecologically sensitive and sensitive to people, and which are not going to create huge amounts of inequality as the current ones are doing, then we have to change the fundamental model of the economy. And I can come back to that later as to what that means. And secondly, we have to change the nature of governance. Now, we say we are a democracy, but, and this is not just India, across the world, Western liberal democracy, which means that we think of ourselves as democratic if we are able to vote. And we have a universal voting, everybody's supposed to, well, now everybody's even not entitled to vote given what's been happening recently in Bihar and elsewhere. But let's assume, okay, everybody is entitled to vote. That's not democracy. Democracy actually is that you and I, wherever we are, in our collective spaces, in our urban neighborhoods, in our village, wherever we are able to take or be centrally a part of decisions that affect our lives, not leave it to politicians and bureaucrats, which is unfortunately what we tend to do. So these two, I'm just giving you two fundamental aspects of where policies themselves are, flawed from a very basic systemic point of view. Then there is the issue of implementation. We have some good policies in place, both on all these different aspects. Yes, we do. But then, because the nature of the economy and politics is such that those who speak the truth, suppose you get a environmental impact assessment expert who actually tells the truth and says this project is problematic, it should not be built, or it should not be built in this particular manner. This mining should not happen, for instance, in the Hasdev forest in Chhattisgarh, because it will irreversibly impact the forest and the Adivasis and the elephants. That consultant will never actually be given a contract ever again. Right. So the whole pressure is, and also because, by the way, the money that is given for those environmental impact assessments is given by the project proponent, no, not by an independent agency, right? So, which project proponent is going to give you money to actually say, sorry, your project is faulty? That's just one. There's many other faults. Another one that I can point out to is people who are going to be affected by these projects are never part of the impact assessment procedures. It's so-called experts, it's the people who fund them, and then it's the bureaucracy in the Ministry of Environment or wherever else who actually says yes or no. The people impacted, let's say the Adivasis in Hasdev, or the Himalayan forest, Himalayan communities, which are going to be impacted by the Char Dham project road, any of these things, right? They're not anywhere in the picture, other than maybe a public hearing, which is also usually a sham. They're not in the picture in terms of decision making. So these are just some very fundamental flaws as to why having a plethora of laws and policies on environment and human rights, etc., is just simply not enough.
That's a very thought-provoking perspective to start the conversation, Ashish. And now, because you have already charted the pathway in terms of the conversations on the fundamental flaws and also the very grassroots fraudulence, like which look appears like like a syndicate, already a well conceptualized network that who already knows where to place the money, where to do the fraud, how to sort of cook up a so-called pseudo authentic story which is deep down fake and false in its application, which is like well structured, already conversed. And if of course something is fallen off from there, then immediately the individuals or the communities who have really voiced out their concerns are immediately penalized in the process. With regards to that, and since again going back to the whole point of your experiences and engagements with communities, with resistant movements, with conservation projects, um, I think we would all like to know from you that as common people, and since you engage with a lot of these aspects in your stories as well, in your short articles as well, that at the minimalistic level, as common people, despite these sort of challenges that you already shared, and many of these challenges, of course, as individuals, it's really difficult to sort of directly question. And we know already the consequences which have been happening in our, not only in our country, in fact, across the world as a part of the process. So as common people, how do we mobilize this sort of consciousness towards the, at the bare minimum level, towards the natural environment, that despite the existence of these flaws at the grassroots level, there are certain pathways, there has to have certain avenues where still we can create the resilience, the resistance in our own ways.
Yeah, I think maybe I can go back to where I and a number of my colleagues began, right? So in 1978, 79, we were growing up in New Delhi as school students. And we used to enjoy ourselves going into the Delhi Ridge Forest, which is the last part of the Aravallis and one of the largest urban forests in the world. But then we saw that there was a lot of destruction taking place, for urbanization, for road construction, garbage dumping, etc. So we thought that instead of just enjoying ourselves, we should also do something as responsible young people growing up in that city. And so we took up action to campaigning for a year and a half to protect the Delhi Ridge Forest, and that was a successful campaign to the extent that the area got declared protected, and much of it is still there, fortunately. Um, Now, when that happened, we realized that even as young people, 15, 16-year-olds, 18-year-olds, who had no political clout, who were not coming from, higher political families and things like that, we still had a voice
Hmm.
which needed to be put out there. And we had a voice that could at least occasionally be heard and successful, right? Um, So if you go, I mean, you take from that time to, let's say, now, where we still, of course, voice our opinions and so on, situation is today much more complex. There are many more powerful vested interests involved. At that point, there weren't so many private corporations involved. Now there's like a whole bunch of them, and hand in glove with the government in many cases. So it is that much more difficult. But on the other hand, ecological consciousness has also significantly grown in these last 40, 50 years, especially now with the climate crisis staring at us every day in the papers, and or things like air pollution in Delhi, right? It's headlines everywhere across the world. So consciousness is also significantly higher now. So we have this paradox that you have a much worse situation now in terms of ecological degradation, but also in terms of the powerful interests that we are up against. But on the other hand, you also have a much more conscious and aware public. How do you bridge this, or rather, how does one kind of resolve this paradox? And I think this is where, for us, our main task with regard to so-called common people who can actually create miracles, and I can give you many stories of that. Our main task is, how do we convert this awareness into concern and then into action? Yeah. And this is where I think telling stories is very important. Stories of the kind I just told you about from 1978, 79, but stories of current times, where people are putting their foot down and saying, no, we will not allow our river to be, or our land to be mined in this way, or we will deal with air pollution in this particular manner, or we will create food security for ourselves without pesticides and fertilizers. We will have energy security for ourselves, but not with huge dams and nuclear power and so on and so forth. So, this is why in the last 15 years or so, especially, we've been focusing a lot on these stories of so called common people. We did a whole series during COVID, by the way, which was called The Extraordinary Work of Ordinary People, which was where communities were much more resilient during the pandemic, both in terms of health and economy, and why and how. How did they do that? So those stories coming out and then the lessons from them, getting those across to the public through videos, through audio, through articles, whatever possible means, through films, and reaching people's hearts, not just minds. I think one of the biggest faults we have, I'm including myself in this, is that the ecological human rights movements have been very cerebral. We kind of reach, the facts and figures and complicated arguments and all of that. And there's a place for that. But there's also a huge place for basically just very simple messages. A child is dying in New Delhi for no fault of hers because of a development paradigm that has created the most polluted city in the world. Okay, and South Asia has 9 out of 10 of the most polluted cities in the world now. So that simple message, and then from there to say, but it doesn't have to be like this. Here are cities which have dealt with pollution across the world, and this is how they've done it, and they've become much more livable cities, including for the poor who are, the most badly affected by all of this. So it's this storytelling and multiple media that would actually, I think, create more consciousness, but also convert consciousness to concern and then to action.
Wonderful. I mean, to think around, and of course, I mean, storytelling vastly have been a very essential tool historically, in fact, for indigenous communities across the world to generate environmental consciousness within their communities and outside across generations. And I think this is something, of course, in our respective contexts, perspectives, and challenges, it's essential to revive that process, not just for the sake of as a casual narrative, but also in a way of introducing as a serious theory, as a methodology, as a way of life, as a way of being and becoming in a time of such severe crisis. Now, from the grassroots, I would like to slightly push you, and and also it makes me more excited after listening to these perspectives. And since recently you have been to Brazil for COP30, um, usually, I mean, generally what we see is these spaces are not the ones which are like, I'm speaking from a very common people's perspective. These spaces are not really the one people really have a lot of faith on, because the usual narrative is, well, policymakers have been doing these visions and perspectives for 20, 40, 50. We have bypassed many. Already have in the coming decades. But at the practical level, we are just seeing that the climate conditions are worsening, the environmental conditions are worsening. And during the, I mean, as at least as per the newspaper reports, we found that there have been, uh, of course, many positive conversations with indigenous communities have taken place, but also there have been resistances. There was a flood that was informed in the newspapers simultaneously going around with COP30. So many different aspects were taking place at the same time when the event was going on. In terms of what you said, in terms of grassroots narratives, in terms of self consciousness, in terms of telling stories, most importantly, in terms of self realizing that it's important that we do something in whatever possible ways it is. Uh, what has been your experience in terms of these elements when you went to COP30, in terms of your panel discussions and interactions and listening to other people?
Well, yes, and so I think most of us who were there, and I have to say this is probably, it may have been the largest civil society mobilization, at least in the history of the climate COPs. By the way, this was my first climate COP. I've not been to any of them before. And the reason I went was because I knew there was going to be a massive people's mobilization, and it would have been a great opportunity, was a great opportunity to meet up with lots of exciting movements and groups from all over the world, and especially also to try and understand the indigenous people's movements in the Amazon and elsewhere. Um, Most of those people who were outside the official COP process, who were in the People's Summit or elsewhere, did not really expect very much from inside the official rooms, and that includes me. Right? So, in fact, many of us never even stepped into the official spaces, and we saw that. I mean, our lack of expectation was met in the sense that the final agreement that came out was, in some senses, a regression even from 2 years back, because, for instance, fossil fuels is not mentioned, deforestation is not mentioned, Maybe the only somewhat positive thing that has come in is that in the so-called Bellum plan of mechanism of action, there is some stuff on just transition, which has been a advocacy by workers groups across the world for a long time. That whatever transition happens to a more climate friendly economy and society, it needs to have the interests of workers who are going to be badly affected very much at the core, right? So there is some element of that, which is probably the only positive thing that came out of it. But mostly otherwise, it was status quo or regression. However, and this is where the hope is, the 50, 60, 70,000 people who are outside, yeah, they basically the extended solidarity building alliances that were possible, the exchange of experiences of what people are doing on the ground to solve their problems, the increased capacity for resistance against climate unfriendly projects like mining and so on, the greater awareness that was created about the false solutions that the same system is giving us, carbon trading and net zero and blah blah blah, all that. To me, all of that was the positive outcome of the COP30 process, or let's say aside from the COP30 process, but using COP30 as a excuse. And let me give you one simple statistic which I found very fascinating. When we were there were two very radical actions by the indigenous peoples. One was storming the official venue and saying, "Why are we not here?" And secondly, blocking the official venue and refusing to move until the president of the COP actually came out and spoke to them. Partly as a result of these actions, the Brazilian government actually announced the recognition of a very large tract of Brazil, including a lot of the Amazon, as being indigenous rights, indigenous collective rights, and that no mining, etc., would be allowed in those areas. Now, why I'm giving this example, which is right now, just 2 weeks, 3 weeks back, is because an earlier study, which was done for North America, which indigenous people call Turtle Island, by the way. North America is a colonial name. On Turtle Island, the resistance movements by indigenous people and other communities and civil society against things like pipelines, oil and gas pipelines, etc., have saved the equivalent of 1/4 of the annual emissions of Canada and the US from being emitted, in the sense that that much more would have actually gone into the atmosphere if the resistance movements had not stopped these projects. Which means that actually on ground action is possibly the most effective way of doing mitigation or avoiding further emissions and further sort of problems in terms of the climate, right? That's one part of it. But the second thing was that the stories that were coming out there in terms of, the system tells us if you want food security, you have to do it through green revolution, chemical based agriculture. System tells us if you want energy security, you have to have, if coal is not the answer, you have to have these mega solar projects and mega wind projects, and which India is going in a big way into these. But what people there were saying is no, we actually have decentralized renewable energy solutions. We have food security and food sovereignty solutions which are based on agroecology, no chemicals, and locally with local knowledge handled by local small scale producers. We have production processes for the goods that we need, say household goods or things like that, which are ecologically friendly and which are where maximum employment can be created. You have hundreds of such examples. We've also been documenting them, as you know, for India and elsewhere, but they were there. And it was this twin message: resistance and constructive alternatives that we saw in a place in that people's mobilization that we're seeing actually across the world. To me, that's where the hope lies, not so much in the governments. If it is governments, it is those who are of countries who are going to be most badly affected, and they are somewhat sensitive to people's, like, for instance, the small island states, many of whom are going to be underwater in the next 20, 30 years, right? Some are already demanding a place in, I don't know, Australia or wherever else as climate refugees. Or it is local administrations, some, city administration, some mayor somewhere, some politician of a small locality somewhere else. Those are the people who are much more sensitive because they have to respond to people's demands and needs, then national governments. National governments are not going to be the solution to any of the big crises. And this climate, war, genocide, inequality, national governments are not the solution. They are part of the problem and will inherently remain part of the problem.
Fascinating, Ashish. And when I was listening to you, and especially when you were also highlighting about the radical solidarities that was, happening outside the gated community of COP30, and also a simultaneous process of resistance, but not just leaving the conversation at the level of resistance, but a simultaneous process of constructive alternatives as well through the local community mobilization. I was also simultaneously thinking that how in India, of course, we need to, uh, for sure, engage with that process on a more mass scale. But we do see that in the pockets of the country, like villages in Tamil Nadu, there are examples, villages in, certain villages in northeastern, several places, several locations of the northeastern parts of India, and various certain villages in the Orisha and various other parts of India where they have introduced community-wide um, cleanliness programs, like how within their community, without really banking on when the municipality will provide us with yellow and green and black dustbins, or when there will be a notice or issuing authority will come and tell us how to keep clean. Instead of relying on all of those elements, the typical mainstream governing elements, they have introduced their own mobilizing perspectives, um, and which has been happening for quite some time. And what is encouraging to see is how the common people are gaining more and more consciousness in the process. However, since you engage with a lot of these initiatives on your side, you have been doing it for some time. Do you think that still the process is quite slow? The process is still quite fragmented, and there is a kind of continuous lack of a collective realization of this mass mobilization. As on the one side, of course, people are gaining more and more consciousness, but there is also a quite a reasonably large group of people who are really not just unconscious but very deliberately ignorant about the process.
Yeah, I would agree with that, Sayan. But let's first talk about some of these examples. Like you mentioned about waste, and you're absolutely right. I mean, you go to a village like Konoma in Nagaland, for instance, you'll not see a speck of plastic or whatever anywhere in that entire village. And it's also a village which has been protecting its forest and its wildlife for the last about 30 years, I think. So, and that's just one of many, many examples. Actually, I'm putting in the chat our website, which has several hundred examples, positive examples of change at the local level, both in villages and in cities. So those examples exist, and I think we need, however small or not so small they might be, we need to be able to celebrate them, put them out, tell people that these exist so that it inspires more such action. But, and you're right here, the majority of people, especially in cities, but increasingly also in villages, have been bombarded so much over the last 20, 30, 40 years with notions of development, with dreams of making it big, with dreams of, okay, you can also have a big house. You can also have a job in which you earn a crore a year. You can also become a famous film star. You can also become the chief minister. You can blah, 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 all that kind of stuff, right? And that whichever place you're in, you do definitely need a 40-inch television set. Otherwise, you haven't made it in life. You do definitely need a smartphone and possibly the latest model. Otherwise, you haven't made it in life. This kind of advertising bombardment and political messaging that has been going on for the last few decades, which basically, and of course, some people succeed in getting all of that, undoubtedly. Um, but it basically ends up benefiting a small section of society at the cost of a very large section. But that large section has been so brainwashed into it. And this is what our education system also does. And our education system, by and large, if you look at our schools, it teaches us to just listen and absorb. It doesn't teach us to question. It doesn't teach us how does one become a person who can ask intelligent questions of authority. Somebody in authority, the teacher in school, the prime minister of the country has told us, and we say, yeah, okay, that must be true. And we just do it. And with social media, that becomes much worse because we know with all the algorithms, it's just constantly coming to us the kind of messaging that the system wants us to create, or advertising where parents are told, oh, your kid will remain short unless he or she eats X food item, right, which is created by that particular company. I won't name the products, but so this is what we're up against, and it's very difficult. We don't have the resources to get across to 1.5 billion people with this kind of messaging, which are the resources that the corporations and the government has. And more, the corporations and governments are controlling the mainstream media. We see what's happening in India, right? If anybody in the media writes anything contrary to it, you are in trouble. So most of the media either gone silent or they're saying exactly what the government wants them to say. There's some that are still sticking their necks out, fortunately, and some people like you are still providing these platforms. But otherwise, people have either gone silent or they're basically actively supporting what the system, what the what the government or the corporations want. So the counter messaging is it's like it's like swimming against a very powerful tide in a very powerful river. But of course, we still have to keep doing it. Now, therefore, you're right that the majority of people are still actually in the. And then on top of all of that, you also have this whole thing of casteism and gender. Somebody has raised a good question in the chat on the issue of Dalits. Now, in India, we have a very long history of discrimination, of inequality. And if you look at who is taking decisions, mainly in the big corporations and in the government, it's still mostly men, and it's still mostly people from the so-called upper castes or so-called upper classes. I'm saying so-called because there's no upper and lower in any natural order of things, right? Um, and so when movements happen by Dalits or Adivasis or women or young people, there is a several hundred years of bias and discrimination that they have to fight against. So it's a tough one, but it's not impossible. And this is why, again, I'm saying stories of where people have managed to do that despite all of this. So let me give you one and then I'll shut up and you can ask the next question. In Telangana, 5,000 Dalit women farmers, okay, Dalit and some Adivasi women farmers, um, in the last 35 to 40 years, and I have been following them ever since then, have created the most incredible revolution in agriculture and media. They, as Dalit women, they were facing casteism and patriarchy like everywhere else. But they started organizing themselves. I'm cutting a very long story short, but they started organizing themselves, mobilizing themselves into women's sanghas, Mahila sanghas in several villages, brought back their traditional varieties of jawar, bajra, ragi, and other sort of crops. Said they wanted to go back completely to organic farming. They didn't believe in, they realized the bad effects of chemicals and of hybrid seeds. And through that, through collective farming, through sharing their seeds, through sharing their knowledge, through claiming rights for women on the land, they were able to transform their situation in 10 to 15 years of having food security, at least for these few thousand families. And then going beyond that and saying it's not enough to have food security. We want food sovereignty, Anna Swaraj, which means complete control over everything to do with food, our land, our water, our knowledge, and our seeds, and what we consume. Okay. And you go there today, the situation of those women farmers is like completely transformed. The dignity with which they are able to hold their heads, the way in which so-called upper caste men farmers are actually coming to them and asking for, how did you make your agriculture so successful? That's a transformation that's taken place. They have their own media unit. They started India's first community radio station, and it still runs. They started a filmmaking unit. They made more than 200 films, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, as I said, it's a very complex story. I'm not going into all of it. Now, to me, that is where ordinary, common people have created a revolution. despite while swimming against the tide, many many tides, right? And if we can do that, and there are many stories like that, then why can that not be possible for all of India or all the oppressed peoples of the world and the oppressed nature of the world? By the way, let's never forget other species.
I think this is fascinating, and when you were talking about the Anna Swaraj, I remember that I read this story in one of the posts, probably of Vikalp Sangam or Global Tapestry of Alternatives. I don't remember which platform, but I read this detailed, yes, Deccan development story as well. That's another fascinating part.
Oh, sorry, Deccan
Um,
Development Society, not story. Sorry, sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah.
yeah, society, yeah. Um, uh, I was just wondering. I mean, I know there will be, and also meanwhile, like it's not just about me speaking. Feel free to put your questions in the chat box. It shouldn't have to be a question. Share your experiences, thought processes, confusions, whatever you wish to share. Also, feel free to raise your hands and just unmute yourself and speak whatever is you feel is very comfortable for you. And meanwhile, as you are thinking, I was just wondering to ask one more thing, Ashish, and this sort of question was revolving across my mind as I've been hearing you speaking and sharing your thoughts. That you shared that back in 1979, how some of your friends you came together and started thinking the necessity of taking certain initiatives, campaignings. And what I loved about and that what I loved about that part was, of course, none of you come from a space where you have heavy political connections or from very, very elitist spaces, access to massive resources. But still, you shared that the campaign started off on a very successful note of what you were trying to put out into the into the social front. You were able to do that to a vast extent. But I believe at the same time, you may have faced quite a lot of challenges as well, right? I mean, of course, doing such a thing is literally standing nose to nose with the capitalistic enterprises who would, of course, will never tolerate people like you and your fellow campaigners. So I mean, in case if it is a very personal question, feel free to just ignore it. But still, is there a possibility to share some of the like a common frame challenges that you encountered in the process, and how did you try to overcome them?
Yeah, sure. I think, and I forgot to actually mention in the introduction also that this 1978-79 was also when we began Kalpavriks, the organization with which I'm still involved. And it was a youth group. Now many of us are much older, but we still have a lot of young people in it. And one of the things it has tried to do, two things that are very important. One, to maintain as far as possible a very democratic structure. So we have no presidents and secretaries and things like that. Everybody is involved in all decisions, which is sometimes cumbersome, but eventually means that any decision taken has much greater possibility of succeeding. But also, secondly, that not to try and go it alone, but to always work in networks. The reason I'm saying this is because the inevitable political backlash that is created because of the kind of positions we take, the stands we take, the actions that we take, demonstrations, the positions we have on many issues, critiquing government policy, etc., means there is going to be a backlash, political backlash or corporate backlash. And not I so much, and in fact, not Kalpurik so much, but many other organizations have faced very severe consequences, shutting down their funding sources, imprisoning people. We know that Sonam Wangchukle, who basically was standing for climate justice for Ladakh and for some level of autonomy so that Ladakh could decide its own future rather than it be decided from New Delhi, which knows nothing about Ladakh, um, is in prison for the last, 2 months now, I think. Not because he's a terrorist or nothing like that, but he's in prison under the National Security Act, by the way, which is meant for for so-called terrorists. So there is that backlash. Now why I mention networking is because one of the, not guarantees, but one of the ways in which we can immunize ourselves to some extent against this backlash is to have a very robust network of organizations across India and where relevant across the world. People who can stand up for the rights of those against whom this backlash happens. When Wang Chukle was arrested, immediately there were national level protests. There were demonstrations in 15, 20 different cities of the country. That doesn't mean he's going to be immediately released, but it does mean that the government will be that much more careful about doing anything with regard to him. Uh, Not everybody is so lucky. There are some people who are behind bars or imprisoned or beaten up and don't have those national connections for there to be that kind of a, uprising and uproar. But that's why our processes through Vikalp Sangam, through the National Alliance for People's Movement, and through other such processes, and globally through the Global Tapestry of Alternatives and elsewhere, is to try and bring on board and connect with as many such activists and organizations and movements as possible, so that there is a mutual support system, there is a mutual solidarity structure, there's a support system for families of those who are imprisoned or killed or beaten up, right? That is really, really, really important, because that backlash is going to happen. Fortunately, I haven't yet faced it. Culpability only to a minimum extent, but many other groups that we work with have faced it, and we are on the radar. We know that, so it could happen anytime. Um, Now, one is that. The second is, and that network and solidarity system has to have different kinds of people. It has to have people who are good at law. It has to have people who are good at media. It has to have people who know how to mobilize people and people's opinion. It has to have people who can do good solid research, so we can provide the evidence of why we are saying what we are saying. If we are countering something, that kind of social networking with multiple different kinds of expertise and experiences levels and so on is very important. The example I always cite is, you have, I'm sure, heard about Niyamgiri and the struggle of the Dongriya Kond Adivasis against mining in their hills, which has so far been a successful struggle. The most important reason it was successful was because all the Adivasis mobilized themselves, were unanimously against the mining, but also because they had civil society supporting them with media support, etc., and legal support all the way to the Supreme Court. Right? So you had this kind of horizontal solidarity and vertical as in spaces, from Niyamgiri in Odisha to Delhi. And in fact, people demonstrating even in London against the UK mining company that wanted to do mining in their hills. That is what actually we need to be able to be, at least to some extent, secure against the kind of backlash that's taking place.
Thank you so much, Ashish. Again, until unless somebody else is having any particular thoughts to share, I think it was a fascinating conversation, Ashish, with you. I know it's an ongoing process. It doesn't really conclude here. We will surely find more avenues to have conversation. But what really comes out of this whole conversation, a very important point is, and I think we must all be very aware and keep in mind that if we really are bothered, and we cannot deny that for sure on and off the record, if we're really, really bothered about the climate catastrophes, about the environmental catastrophes that have been, taking place across the country, across our localities, across the world, we need to find out ways together to mobilize ourselves. Yes, there is an amazing level of risk, challenges, life threats. We have enough proof around us. But do we really have any other option? Of course not. We have come to that point where it's important, like, instead of playing the blame game that the policy is not getting applied, instead of putting the gun on somebody else's shoulders and trying to shoot it out. Of course, there are problems. There are problems in policies. There are problems in applications. There is corruption. There is fraudulence. There are flaws, and a lot of these have already been spoken today by Ashish while we were having the conversations. But then again, the process has to start with us, and the process has to start right now without a second thought. Of course, in a very structured, thoughtful way, not in a hasty, violent way, but we have to start it right away. Um, I see there is a comment by Sneha in the chat box. I just wanted to read it out for all of us. I just want to share my experience living in Delhi. I used to live near that big pile of Delhi. I saw it by myself how year by year it became large. I don't know, Sneha, would you like to, only if you're comfortable, would you like to unmute yourself and would you like to share some more insights about that? Because it's, of course, a very, very, very important point that you bring forth. Um, Maybe I'm not sure if Sneha can hear us. Um, but yes, I mean, yes, Sneha.
Hello.
Yes, hi, Sneha.
Uh, yes. Actually, I just wanted to share my experience as Ashish Kothari sir started with living in Delhi and how he spent his childhood days there. Actually, I born and brought him in Delhi, and a large and like most of the year, I spent my life near that big dumping zone of Delhi, and I saw it by myself how day by day it became larger and larger and larger, and that smoky air beside like in the whole environment. And now I'm in Himachal doing my PhD. I just think that how people living there are still feeling what kind of experience they are having still now. Sorry, I'm hearing so much. I having a bit cold. Yeah, I just wanted to share my experience. Thank you.
Thank you, Sneha. I think that's very important. I often also wonder how people are, actually, right now I'm wondering how anybody is able to live in Delhi or still wants to live in Delhi, given all the horrifying news we've been hearing, right? On average, everybody's lifespan is being cut by 8 or 9 years on average. So some people must be much worse. Now, of course, for a lot of people, there isn't a choice. Especially if you're poor, you're a laborer, or you're a person who really, it's not like you can pack up and go somewhere else and get a job. So a lot of people are there for that reason, but there's lots of others who do have a choice and still there, stay there. But even more important is that there are many examples in India where people have actually risen up in protest against things like those kind of garbage dumps, and said something has to be done about it, right? It has to be properly treated, whatever different technologies are available to treat that garbage, but also asking this question, why is there so much garbage in the first place? You know, when I was saying about superficial solutions, in a sense, recycling is a superficial solution. It's like you keep creating more and more and more and more and more garbage, and somebody somewhere is going to recycle it, right? And of course, recycling is important insofar as garbage is created. But more important is asking this question, why do we have so much garbage in the first place? Let me give you a simple example. When I was growing up in New Delhi, I used to be able to go and buy biscuits without any packaging from a thelawala. Those have all gone. Now you want to buy biscuits, they're in triple, quadruple packaging. Why? Doesn't make it any more hygienic. It's just that much more profit making by those who are making the packages and those who are selling them to us, saying, oh, this is the most safest, most tasty biscuit that you can ever find. And the same with so many different products. If you had products that could last 30 years in the past, today the same companies are producing the same products, but with built-in obsolescence so that they will go bad in 10 years. So then you have to go and buy another one. That we have to ask the more fundamental question of, why is our society creating so much waste in the first place? Why have we become so wasteful and consumerist? I saw a lovely video yesterday which I must tell you, because this question of consumerism keeps coming to me, Sayan, and I think it's very important because we're all, in some way or the other, we're all guilty of it. Of Japanese youth. Now, we know that Japan was amongst the first ones to go into this kind of technological revolution and this whole capitalist thing of buy more and buy more. And, it's nationalistic to buy Japanese kind of stuff. Today, there's a movement, still small but growing rapidly, amongst youth in Japan saying, we are going to spend a whole year buying nothing, no new thing. We are actually going to do a slowdown or an anti consumption drive. And increasingly, they're doing studies which are showing that young people who are doing that find their quality of life has actually improved because now they have more time for talking to each other. They have more time for going out and taking a walk in a forest or whatever else that they like doing, listening to music, and not just going shopping or mindlessly scrolling through, on their screens, what is the latest product that's available. So it's fascinating, actually. Young people are asking really fundamental questions, and if we can again, and I come back to stories, if we can tell these stories, and young people can actually get motivated to say we can protest against a landfill and shut it down. We can ask the question of why do we buy so much. We can ask these fundamental questions and ask for basic changes in society and economy and politics. I think the more we can spread that, the more the possibility that over the next generation or two, we'll have that many more solutions coming. And Sayan, I also just wanted to tell everybody that I've put lots of resources in the chat.
Awesome.
They're all available for free PDF download, including the books. And I think your Anna Swaraj, you might have read in this book, Anna Alternative Futures. It's
Yes.
a vision of India in 2100, Indian agriculture and food in 2100, and then coming back to now and how do we get there. So that alternative books, futures book has similar things on education, health, conservation, food, agriculture, Adivasis, pastoralism, many different topics. The second one, Pluriverse, is actually 100 examples of such solutions from all over the world. And then there's a whole bunch of other articles and all, which people are free to look at. And two films at the end, which I would urge you all to watch also. The second last one, Churning the Earth, has 6 stories of really fantastic transformation in different parts of India. And the last one is a story on the Vikalp Sangam process of the last 10 years. So please do take a look at these resources.
And also, I mean, thank you so much,
Anish?
Ashish. Yeah, sorry. Thank you so much, Ashish, for sharing these stories. I would specifically, I mean, all of these works are fascinating. Specifically, I would like to recommend the Pluriverse because when I first started reading the works, I found it as fascinating foundational work, which is very rare in this field. Like we do churn out a lot of whole loads of research papers and analysis and complex thought processes, which are, of course, I'm not denying their importance. But then when it comes to the question of foundational initiative, I think Pluriverse is a fascinating place to begin the process. Like when we often ask this question, where to begin? Um, uh, Anish has a question in the chat, and Anish asks that how do we see environmental movements achieving electoral power in India?
So, Anish, the an answer that I could give might disappoint you, which is to say that I don't think we should be looking for. I don't think we should be looking for electoral power because whoever gets into government anywhere across the world has ended up failing the people. This is, I think, including all the so-called revolutionary leftist governments, because there's something inherently problematic in centralizing power in a government, however progressive we might be. That's a long-term view I'm taking, and which is why I talk about radical democracy, democracy on the ground, Swaraj, where people say we are the government where we live, right? So that's a long-term thing. In the short run, of course, I agree with you. We need to be able to find ways to make the government accountable, which could mean that those of us who have that aptitude get into politics and be there and try and influence from within. But it could also mean that as people's movements from outside, like say what the what the right to information movement did, or the Forest Rights Act movement did, or the movements for better labor laws did. Those are all movements that have created the pressure for policy shifts by those who are elected in power and bureaucrats to make things much better for people on the ground, right? So I think these are the sorts of, this is a long-term and short-term kind of view that we would need to take. We did in Vikalp Sangam, you'll find that on the website. We issued a People's Manifesto in 2024 before the elections. So we've also kind of tried to say this is what people's issues are, this is what the kind of solutions we want. Here it is out there. Let all political parties look at it now. Didn't have much of an effect, but that's the kind of thing that I think we just need to do more and more of. There was similarly thing picking up from that in Trichur and elsewhere in smaller constituencies. People have also done that, and that's had greater impact because it's a localized. You have more of a possible influence on a local administration or a city administration or a state government than necessarily at a national level. So that's a brief one for you, Anish. And then I think there's a thing from Arundhati. People are uncomfortable while trying to make a change. Yeah, no, you're right. But I think this is where two things are very important. One, like I was saying right at the beginning, transforming consciousness to concern to action is also a process where you become passionate enough to say, okay, if it's a little discomfort, I'm okay with it because I'm helping somebody else to have less discomfort, to not be badly impacted because I'm producing less waste or whatever I'm doing, right? That's one thing. Or I'm cycling rather than taking the car everywhere. That's one kind of thing. But the second thing is also to push for systems which make it convenient to live much more ecologically sensitively, right? So in many cities now, we have shops where you can get organic food. Unfortunately, they're only for the rich. So we have to push for systems in which organic food becomes available to the poor in cities also, so that they don't have to buy junk, chemical-laden junk. We have to push for systems, and some state governments are already doing this, for locally grown, diverse foods, if possible organic, to be available in PDS, ration shops, for these midday meals for schools. Some like Odisha, Karnataka are beginning to move in that direction. So make it not so inconvenient for us to be living ecologically sensitive lifestyles. So both things are needed. Make people more passionate so that some discomfort is okay, but also make it more convenient for people to be able to switch to much more sensitive lifestyles.
Great. Thank you so much, Ashish. I mean, thanks to all of you who have joined, who have listened, who have shared, who have asked questions. It was fascinating, Ashish, once again, to have you with us. And not only Ashish, I mean, to all of you to have with us to be a part of the conversation, because it's not just about having a conversation, but it is also, you know, even within this very, limited space and time, we still are able to think together, to envision together, to see some possibilities despite the challenges that are there at our hands. And maybe I don't know, Ashish can sort of conclude with some final words based on there is an observation. Maybe that could be our final point of observation for today, that your radical ecological democracy is a continuation and deviation from Gadgil and Guha's conservative social liberalism model. Now it's concerning how much decentralizing is happening. I think it's quite different. And yes, and I think it requires, of course, a very elaborative conversation on that, because it has its own histories, and a lot of it is of course mentioned in the website, and it's very reflective of the articles that are published as a part of the RED initiative, and then the different aspects that are outlined there. So thank you so much, Ashish. Thanks to all of you, and and all of you just have a great evening, great time, and let us work together in whatever little possible ways to create a safe, a more healthy, a more hearty, and a lovable society or world around us. So
And can I just have one last
sure,
observation?
sure.
I think no action is too small. This is also in relation to one of the comments. Let if you there's a single person who can set an example that a million other people can actually learn from and get inspired by. And there are thousands of examples of that across the world. There's a single village in central India, which is the one which came up with the slogan that we are the government in our village, which has now inspired hundreds of more villages to move towards protecting their forests, taking back collective control over their land and forests, and moving towards much more sustainable livelihoods. It was one village that did it, a small village, just 300 people. So nothing is too small, right? So please let's remember that whenever we try and take actions, we are not too small, never.
Great. And I think that's such a fascinating note to sort of conclude our conversation. And we wish that we will have the possibility of continuing with this process in this avenue or many other avenues for sure. So thank you so much once again, and please stay well, stay safe, and let us work together towards creating a way better society than we are living today.